call the committee back to order and now recognize Mr. Edwards of Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I can get my...
Oh, I'm the culprit.
Okay. I've had a lot of friends go to a great extent to keep me from talking, Mr. Chairman, but never. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing. I think while there are sometimes partisan differences on this budget committee regarding what the priorities and responsibilities of the federal government ought to be, one issue in principle that ought to bring us all together is the idea that when we are spending taxpayers' dollars for programs, we should work together to see that those dollars are being spent effectively, efficiently, with clear goals in mind. And I think I can say as a Democrat to my Democratic colleagues, I think in years past, sometimes we have tended to pass a bill based on, or funding based on a good intention, but good intentions aren't good enough when it comes to spending taxpayers' dollars. And we who believe in government ought to be the first in line to say we're going to be very tough on ensuring that programs are accomplishing their goals, because if they aren't, ultimately taxpayers will lose their credibility in the programs themselves. So I salute you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. I thank all of the witnesses for your input and your leadership in this area as well. In that spirit, Mr. Johnson, let me say one reason I took a few more minutes to come back from our votes is I went downstairs from the House floor to talk to the subcommittee staff that I work with from my vantage point as chairman this year of the Military Construction and Appropriations Subcommittee. And I asked if they had ever, either this year and previous years, ever met with OMB staff to review the analysis that your agency has carried out regarding the effectiveness of military construction and VA programs. And their answer was no, not this year and not in their memory. So I would, whether that's my subcommittee's fault or OMB's, doesn't really matter, but let me just say, in the spirit of my opening comments, I would welcome your staff meeting with me or my staff as we start to go to conference on the Milcon VA bill to look at what we can glean from that analysis. And an example, a kind of question that so basic to me but still can't get answered very well is the VA healthcare system generally a good bang for the buck? My general belief is yes, it is. It's an outstanding system, and the conventional wisdom is that we provide quality care for fewer dollars than the private and nonprofit and for-profit healthcare system. But I'm not sure I could quantify that judgment. So by the same token, I was very involved in the new public-private partnership program we've had in military housing that I think generally has been accepted by the departments of the agencies within the Department of Defense as an outstanding program, but I haven't seen any kind of economic analysis to compare that to the old system. So I, for one, who at least chairs one appropriation subcommittee, would welcome more interaction between us on this.
I'll make sure that happens, sir.
Thank you. I would, Mr. Walker had brought up, Mr. Johnson, the issue of analyzing tax preferences, where we call them tax expenditures, legally, or tax preferences. Doesn't bother me one way or the other, but let's call them tax preferences out of respect to others. The fact is that GAO has put out a report saying that they do represent a huge loss of revenues based on preferences that some companies, some groups of individuals, some industries get compared to others. It also says that OMB has only rarely used the performance-based analysis on tax preferences. Could you tell me what the administration's official position is on that issue, and should we expand performance-based analysis to the effectiveness and efficiency and the clarity of goals of tax preferences?
I know it was the administration's official position to develop the part to analyze programs, both discretionary and non-discretionary programs. And so the feeling about using it or something like it to evaluate tax programs, it was not no, but not yet. That's still our position. And unofficially, it sounds like it's something we ought to do, and we ought to review the mechanism or decide that it's that the part mechanism or some version of the part mechanism and figure out what we want to do.
Right.
But our position has never been that we didn't want to do it. It was just not yet. We wanted to focus on how programs worked because we wanted to use that then as the basis for driving performance management, people management within programs, and cause the federal government to become more purposeful about the way they spend the money.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I see my time is up, so I'll withhold my additional questions. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards. Mr. Doggett is not here. Barry, Mr. Scott of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Walker, you indicated that, I think implied that tax expenditures were hidden in the budget process. Doesn't PAYGO expose these expenditures, at least prospectively, if we try to pass them in the future?
My understanding is there's some prospective application, but not ones that already exist, if you will. They're in the base, and that's what I'm talking about.
Okay. And when we talk about performance measures, is that a budget committee function, or is a suggestion that authorizing committees on reauthorization should be proactive in ascertaining whether or not the programs have been performing, and then kind of report to the budget committee or to the appropriations committee?
I believe that the country would benefit and the Congress would benefit for having a set of key outcome-based indicators for budgeting, authorization, reauthorization, appropriations, and oversight purposes. When you are considering legislation to begin with, one of the basic questions ought to be, what are you trying to accomplish, and how are you going to end up measuring whether or not it is making a difference? And so I think it crosses all those different constitutional responsibilities.
I serve as chair of the crime subcommittee. What kind of performance budgeting policies would you suggest for budgeting in the area of crime policy?
Crime rates, the nature of violent crime. I mean, there are issues that relate to actual outcomes. What are we doing? Those would be a couple of examples in that area. Let me give you a couple other examples that are outside of that area. Math proficiency, science proficiency, life expectancy at birth, infant mortality, household savings rates. There are a number of things that right now, quite frankly, we're measuring, and many other countries are measuring, but we're not using it for purposes of informing our decisions on spending programs, tax policies, and regulatory actions.
And if the expenditure in a crime policy issue did not lead to a reduction in crime, reduction in violence, then we ought to reconsider making that expenditure?
Right. You need to have more evidence in order to be able to make informed decisions about which programs and policies are working and which aren't, how to redirect limited resources and authorities to achieve the maximum impact.
Well, this is hard to understand because most crime policy is slogan generated. That is, you come up with a good slogan and you codify it, and it helps politicians get elected. What you are suggesting is that we ought to use our common sense and actually reduce crime. How does that help us get reelected?
My objective, Mr. Scott, is to help the Congress, help the country, help the American people.
Could you say a word about a lot of the testimony is on health care, and it seems to me if you don't have employer-based health care, there'd be no incentive with the tax benefit, there'd be no incentive for the employers to actually provide the health care.
Well, I'll let Mr. Orszag
how are people going to, how are we going to have, we're trying to get more people insured. What would happen if we did not have this tax expenditure?
Well, let me answer that and then go to Mr. Orszag. First, I don't know that Mr. Orszag is talking about eliminating any tax preference. From my standpoint, I think you have to recognize that there are a variety of forces that cause employers to offer health care, not just the tax preferences.
Well, if you don't have the tax preference, that is the rationale.
No. Well, the number one benefit of preference by employees, and I used to practice as the worldwide head of a human capital consulting firm before I had this job, the number one employee benefit of preference for employees is health care. Number two is health care. Number three is health care. So the market says employees want health care as part of their basic compensation package. The the tax incentives are icing on the cake, but they are by no means going to reduce the demand or desire of employees for health care. And I'll let Mr.
Yeah, Mr. Scott, if I could just add, clearly the current tax preference provides one incentive for employers to offer health care, but in analyzing proposals like the administration's proposal to transform the current tax preference into something else, we had to struggle with what other aspects of the employer-provided package would still persist. And our estimates suggest there would be a reduction in employer-provided coverage, but it would still be the bulk of coverage. And the reason is administrative cost savings from large employers being able to pool people together, and the pooling mechanism through employers. So unless you specifically, you get a group rate. And you get administrative cost savings because it's not just a group rate by pooling people together, but you're doing it in an employment setting where it's easier to sign people up, and the back office kind of steps are also easier.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Mr. Boyd of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm very pleased that you've decided to take on this issue in this hearing, and also it's very obvious that these three panelists have a good grasp of the principles that would be required to take on this monumental task. When I was in the Florida legislature in 1994, I chaired a committee that wrote a piece of legislation called performance-based budgeting. That ultimately came into law, was signed by then Governor Lawton Chiles, and now we have 13 or so years of history of performance-based budgeting in Florida, and that has been hailed by some, including the National Conference of State Legislatures, as one of the premier performance-based reporting and budgeting laws and states in the country. I would ask those of you on the panel, are you familiar with this, and have you studied it, and is that or some other similar system one that we can use as a model? Because this is not going to be easy.
There was a hearing 2 years ago, I think, and Mike Conaway and Congressman Cuellar were on the panel with me, and Congressman Cuellar was talking about performance-based budgeting in Texas. I'm sure it wasn't as good as it was in Florida, but maybe it was close. And a lot of the things that he pointed out were being done in Texas, he was recommending be done here, that they have this kind of information and that kind of information. And the thing that came out of that hearing was actually the kind of information he's calling for exists. It's this performance information, but it's not used, which is, we haven't done a good job of communicating it. Maybe the interest level here, or tweaking the interest level up here. As you make this comment, I was writing down, we need to look at, in our world, all the examples of performance-based budgeting in the states, and what are the lessons learned? How do different states use the information to make smarter budget decisions, appropriation decisions? And are there any suggestions about what we might be doing differently at OMB or in the executive branch, or what this committee or the appropriators might be doing differently? I'll bet that we haven't studied that to see if there are any lessons learned as much as we should have.
Before we go to the other panelists to answer that question, I might add that we went all over the country studying other governmental entities. Texas was one of them, but we found lots of our good work or good examples of good systems in cities, municipalities, and counties. So, Mr. Walker.
Mr. Boyd, I'm somewhat familiar with that. As you know, I'm a Florida CPA and lived in Florida a number of years. I know that Florida was an early adopter of performance-based budgeting. I know you had something to do with that. I know that GAO did some work in the mid-1990s, which included looking at a number of performance-based uses at state level, and Florida was a leader at that time. We haven't done work on it in recent years, and quite frankly, we would entertain a request from this committee to take a look at what's the state of performance-based budgeting, should you desire us to do that, because I think it clearly is meritorious.
The only thing I would add is that my understanding, for whatever it's worth, is that at the state level, performance-based budgeting has not been widely applied to two of the areas that we were discussing here, in particular, for example, state Medicaid programs and exactly what they are accomplishing or not, and similarly SCHIP, and then also tax expenditures. So they're very useful for the areas that they're applied to, but at least from a federal budget perspective, there are big pieces that are not as analyzed.
It's obvious, well, I can tell you from having been through this exercise at a lower level of government, that you have to, it's not about just having information. It's about creating a framework or a structure in which you use that information with definable and measurable principles of measurement, of performance, duplication, waste, fraud, and all of those things come into play. But you have to have a structure which tells the bureaucracy of a government that this is the way we're going to do it, and that structure has to be in a law. Obviously, that bureaucracy is a very, very difficult one to break through here in Washington, D.C. Are you folks optimistic that we could do that if Congress and administration put our heads to it?
I'm confident, primarily because we are getting agencies to do this, to focus on results by holding them accountable for it. What we have found is, and it would be even stronger, it would be even more compelling if there were some congressional reasons for doing it, if some of this was in statute. We have found that when you sit around with agency leadership and say, here's what we want to do, here's how we want to run the railroad, don't you agree? You have goals, you have performance, you report on it quarterly or every 6 months or whatever, and you corrective action plans, performance action plans, we want to make this very public, don't you agree this is a good idea? And they'll say, well, yes, well, let's do it this way. So then we say, here's the way we're going to run the railroad, and then every quarter let's assess who's doing what they said they were going to do, and when are we getting to the point where it's a desired level of performance management. We do that. There's no law that says this will happen, but it's the president, starting with the president on down, that says this is the way we're going to do it. And what we're finding, so you could say, well, then if another president came in and it wasn't the priority, would you lose it? Maybe. But my sense is that the people in the agencies understand this is good for the agencies. This is something that, by and large, it will make HUD work better. It will make Interior work better, and so it will make it a better place to work, a better place to be a public servant. And so the employees get it. This is not something that's bad for them, but they want to be trained how to do it. They want the money to be able to do it. They want the time to be able to do it. So I think what we need to do is figure out how to help agencies do it even more successfully going forward. It exists in the executive branch now. It's not locked in. Doesn't permeate their entire being, but it's something they get. It's something they're doing because we're holding them accountable for doing it.
Mr. Chairman, I know my time's run out. Are we going to have a second round so that we may continue with? Okay, I'd ask the other panelists to respond to this.
First, Mr. Boyd, you already have one law, and that's called the Government Performance and Results Act. And as I noted in my testimony, we need full implementation of that law, and we don't believe the executive branch has fully implemented the government-wide performance plan. We think they need to do more on the horizontal dimension, and they also need to consider tax preferences, as I've noted. Secondly, we've also recommended in my testimony that the Congress ought to consider a congressional performance resolution. And this committee obviously could take a lead. I think this committee could also take the lead on looking at the concept of key national indicators. And I think that's something that, quite frankly, is meritorious of moving forward with a public-private partnership to take that concept and make it a reality, as other countries have. We've done some work on that. We're happy to do more work on that. I also think that this committee could also think about doing something similar to what the Senate Budget Committee did back early in my tenure, and that is to form some task forces on health care, key national indicators, selected issues that you may have an interest in, to see what might be a proper way forward, not just for this committee, but for the Congress, and would be happy to work with you on that. So first, we've got to fully implement the existing laws. Then we need to figure out what else can be done administratively. And I come back to what I said earlier. Even if the information exists, it's got to be used. There's information that exists right now that is not being used. And that is a cultural issue. It's not a legislative issue. It's the fact that people aren't used to it, they're not being held accountable for it, and therefore why bother?
If I could just tunnel in on one area in addition to the comments that have already been made. With regard, for example, to Medicare, there would be statutory changes that would be required in order to significantly expand the information base that we have, which is currently lacking. We simply do not have enough information on what works and what doesn't, what's causing the variation in Medicare spending, what type of spending is worth it and what's not, what works better, what works not so well. And for Medicare to then incorporate that information into its payment system so that we would move from a fee-for-service to a fee-for-value one would require statutory changes also. So in that particular area, as just one example, there are statutory changes that would be necessary to build the information base and then to apply the information.
May I add one more comment? A good bit of GPRA has been implemented. Agencies do a lot of reporting about performance. In my opinion, our opinion, the part information gives us more consistent, higher quality, outcome-oriented performance information with which to comply with GPRA requirements. I think most people would agree that little change in performance has come about as a result of GPRA. And it's not because for the programs that we're managing, it's not so much for the mandatory, and it's nothing, and we've got nothing going on in the tax, whatever you want to call it, programs. But for the discretionary programs that we pay a lot of attention to and trying to hold increasingly so, managers responsible for performing well, little attention is paid to what is reported to Congress about performance. It's not as specific in the GPA format as it can be, and I think as it should be. And when it is reported, very little attention is given to it. There's very little so what. This program doesn't work. What are you going to do to cause this program to work at an exceptional level versus a marginal level? And this isn't a budget issue so much as at a congressional level, and I think we can even do a better job in the executive branch. One of the things that has really helped sort of set the groundwork for change in this executive branch is 3 years ago or so, they changed the law that allowed the senior executive service, 8,000 of them, 90% of which are career, to be held accountable for the performance, have performance measures in their program performance measures in their performance goals. So they're not held accountable for having proper competencies. They're held accountable for the performance of their programs. And their pay increase can be tied to their performance rating. We could have had this law 3 years ago and not been able to abide by it because we didn't have the performance measures to use to evaluate a manager's performance. Now we have performance measures. They're not perfect, never will be, but they're very, very good. We have the data now to increasingly every year hold managers accountable for the performance of the programs. That's where real rubber meets the road, is when individual executives in programs and all of their staff are held accountable for how their programs work. That can take place in the executive branch with the help of some legislation, and if we work together to prevent some legislation that would keep that from happening. There are some interests in this town that would like that not to happen, as you can imagine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
We'll go next to Mr. Cooper and then to Mr. Porter of Nevada. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can't think of a more important topic than helping taxpayers get more value for their money. We have excellent witnesses here today. I'm disappointed at member response. This testimony should be required reading for all of our colleagues so that we can get more on top of these issues. First, let me focus on the Medicare discussion that Mr. Orszag was having with Mr. Boyd. I want to commend Peter for beefing up the CBO staff in the healthcare area, and I think there are some very explosive parts of the testimony for members who really understand. First, the map on page 5, the geographical differences in Medicare reimbursement are stunning. Completely different pay levels for doing exactly the same medical procedure. Completely unjustifiable, but yet it's been law for 40 plus years, and we seem to live with those discrepancies. But my real point is the chart on page 8, which shows the relationship between quality of care and expenditure of money on care. There are a lot of dots on the map. I wish that CBO in the future would put each state's identity
Okay.
on those dots, and also do what I think the Commonwealth Foundation has done, which is to draw a trend line over those dots so that you can see the inverse relationship between money and quality. So in other words, the more you spend, you don't get more quality. The more you spend, the less quality you get, which is the opposite of what it should be. So I hope CBO wasn't pulling any punches in this case, but an overlay trend line would be helpful for members so they could see clearly the relationship.
I would hope that I'm getting known for not pulling punches. So no, that was not on purpose. We can look into the suggestions that you made for future publications.
I thought the other most explosive element of the testimony was regarding tax expenditures. And here, Comptroller Walker excels. Most members of this body do not realize that the Ways and Means Committee's pocket jurisdiction is larger than the total discretionary spending. It's about of every other committee in Congress combined. Now, I'm not against the Ways and Means Committee, but that is an amazing side feature of their jurisdiction to be able to effectively spend $800–900 billion a year, and that's not even their primary portfolio. So I'd like to ask Mr. Walker what we can do to try to rein in these, expenditures and drag, basically, because they're masquerading as something else. And I think, to a curious effect, what should we do about this expenditure problem?
Well, first we need more transparency with regard to these tax preferences and the cost of these tax preferences. We need to have more transparency in the financial statements. We should have more transparency as part of the annual process the budget goes through. Maybe the congressional budget resolution that we recommended. Secondly, we need to also subject them to an outcome-based analysis. And hopefully, if the Congress can move forward with this concept of key national indicators through a public-private partnership, then we should subject not just discretionary spending, but also mandatory spending, as well as tax preferences, to an analysis of whether or not they're making an outcome-based difference. I think whenever you're passing new legislation and reauthorizing existing policies and programs, you need to determine what you're trying to accomplish on an outcome-based measure. Put it right in the legislation, and make sure, therefore, that there's a periodic analysis of that, both on the tax side and the spending side, that Congress automatically will consider as part of its normal constitutional responsibilities. Tax preferences are largely off the radar screen. You can't manage what you don't measure. You can't hold accountable what there is not adequate transparency for.
I thank the gentleman for his response. Effectively, it seems to me you're saying that as uncontrollable as some entitlement spending is, tax expenditure spending could be even more uncontrollable, because oftentimes we don't even know what it is. There was a Bush Treasury official, I think her name was Pam Olson, who testified before this committee a couple of years ago, saying that tax expenditure spending is basically unmeasured and unmeasurable, unverified and unverifiable. And that should alarm anyone who's interested in good government. And yet, year in, year out, we seem to do very little about it. I see that my time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this important hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Mr. Porter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this opportunity today. And we have three of the most talented individuals in Washington. And I say that I do respect. We appreciate your opinion and work closely with you for a number of years, and I appreciate you being here. And we could choose who has talent or not if you'd like. And I know, Mr. Walker, you were just in Las Vegas. Did you see OJ while you were there? Anything we need to know about?
It's amazing. I was in there doing the fiscal wake-up tour the day that OJ got arrested, and I didn't come across him. And
you weren't at the Palace Station, obviously.
Don't know him, haven't seen him, and don't really worry that I haven't.
In all seriousness, we appreciate you being in Nevada. And I understand it was very well received, and thank you for your insights. And again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess sometimes try to oversimplify things in trying to compile information and put it in words that maybe our constituents can understand. But it seems to me, and this may be more of a comment than a question, but it seems to me we need a day of reckoning in Congress. That there's one day of that year when we look at expenditures, we look at revenues, how much we've spent or how much we've promised to spend. And on that particular day, everything comes to a point where we see how much we don't have. And I know we go with continuing resolutions and times and there's omnibus bills, but it doesn't seem to me, unless I'm missing something, that there's that one day of reckoning, other than tax day, of course, which I think should be election day, April 15th, where this Congress, this body, and I believe that we could do it together in a bipartisan way, look at this is where we are today, this is what we've promised, and this is what we don't have. Is there such a mechanism in place? Can we do that?
I can tell you that I lead strategic planning for auditor generals around the world, and also I'm on the board of the international organization, and some countries have such a thing. And I think one of the things that this Congress ought to consider is one time a year have the director of OMB, the Comptroller General of the United States, and the director of CBO report to the Congress as a whole. And I'm talking about not just sending a paper, I'm talking about physically be there with the Congress to present an assessment of where we are and where we're headed in different perspectives. I think that would be invaluable, and I know that happens in some countries. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen in ours.
Well, I think for families, and we look at our budget, and at the end of the year, you look at and you look at your credit cards, and you look at your bills, and how much income you have. There is a day with our families when we know we're short or we're doing okay. And the same with business. We have that. At the end of the year, we reconcile our books. And I would like to work with you if we could make that presentation to this body at some point so that we can see so the American people can see where we are. I appreciate that.
I was just going to add that one of the purposes of CBO's budget outlook that's released in January and then in August is to give a snapshot of both where we have been and where we're going. And one of the purposes of the budget resolution, to the extent it's adopted on an annual basis, is to try to take that information into account. So I agree there's much more that can be done to...
Or be more transparent. I think you're providing the information, but maybe we can consolidate and more concise.
Sure.
And I'd appreciate that, yes.
It's not just that, Mr. Porter. There's no question that CBO provides a lot of valuable information, and so does GAO, and so does OMB. But there's a difference between sending up electronic or print documents up here and appearing before the body of the whole and making an oral presentation using charts and graphs that convey a lot of information very concisely. That's what's missing, and that's what's needed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Etheridge is next. Ms. Etheridge, you yield just for a second. Let me say a word.
Sure.
This is the point I was about to make about the SAR. I recall when it was created in the Pentagon, I was working for the Comptroller when it was created. 12 years later, when I came to Congress, I went over and started pulling out SARs just to see how they looked. Looked the same way they had 12 years ago. They weren't more useful because they hadn't been used. One of the things that happens when you engage and use the document is it becomes better and better adapted to its intended purposes. When it sits on the shelf, nobody uses the end product. It just gives you the same old output every year. Mr. Etheridge.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the hearing. Let me thank each of you for being here, and I won't elaborate on the accolades because we're honored to have you here. Let me just make a couple of points and ask a question because I served as a state legislator before I came here and chaired the Appropriations Committee, and then served for 8 years as state superintendent and ran one of the largest budgets in our state. And what you say is true, but the real challenge gets below really that, as you well know. And let me just give an example, and then I'm going to ask my question, because I do think that performance-based budgeting really holds some potential, really maximum potential for public agencies if it is used and used properly. For example, let me just give you one example that we are underfunding education right now, in my view, if we're really going to continue to to be a strong country, and we're powering it off against other things. I think that's dangerous. The administration sent a budget up, cutting education by $1.5 billion, eliminating 44 various ages. Sounds like a great idea if you don't know the difference. But when you start looking at it, it was a tool that was called Program Assessment Rating Tool. Sounds good, makes sense. However, when you find out that, number one, none of the public participants were in it, none of the stakeholders were consulted, they just reached in and parceled them out, threw them up on a table. And the problem you have with that is the folks in the field are dealing with training the next generation of workers, and they don't have input. That's not a very good performance-based process, in my view, having worked with. People need to be engaged and believe it's fair. And we're getting close to a reckoning day, so I think you're absolutely right. So let me ask you a question. And I do want to applaud the work that each of you are doing, and thank you for it. It is very important to our work. To develop options, though, for policymakers to address the looming train wreck that you've been talking about, and I think it's one we got to deal with on the budgets, on the horizons, in a variety of ways. And I won't thank Chairman Spratt for calling this meeting. Let me just ask each one of you for one suggestion, just one. And you've given us a whole bunch, but just one that we could use to accomplish that purpose. Just one. Whoever wants to start first. Mr. Johnson.
I think that this committee or Congress or the administration should publicly declare that they want to be held accountable for the government working well and better every year in a demonstrable, quantifiable, to a demonstrable and quantifiable degree.
That's more like a policy statement, okay?
It's just that commitment will drive behavior, it will drive a level of transparency that doesn't exist now. It will drive an attention to performance or non-performance that doesn't exist now. And it will drive real life things happening, unlike that are happening now.
Very good, thank you. Walker.
Well, I've testified before that with regard to our fiscal challenge, the best thing you can do is to reimpose tough statutory budget controls on both sides of the ledger, dealing not just with discretionary spending, but also mandatory reconsideration triggers for mandatory spending, and also to put tax preferences as part of that radar screen. You have to do that. Now, as far as performance budgeting, I would say moving towards an annual congressional performance-based budget resolution. Now, it's going to take you, you're going to have to do some work to get there, because you need to, you're right, there's a lot of debate about, well, which indicators do you want to use in order to assess performance. But agreeing that there's a desire to move to some type of annual congressional performance-based budget resolution, and then putting in place mechanisms to make that a reality over time.
Starts that dialogue.
I would say if there's one step that, looking out over the future, you wanted to adopt a perspective to get more for your money from the federal budget, it's in healthcare, and perhaps the most single auspicious thing that could be done if you wanted to move in that direction is to vastly expand the amount of comparative effectiveness research that is done, that is examining what works and what doesn't through registries, through trials, et cetera, and then tying financial incentives and other incentives to the results of that research.
Thank you. Thank all three of you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Etheridge. Mr. Becerra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. I'm not sure if you explored this earlier or not, but I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about the expenditure side. And Comptroller General Walker, let me start with you and ask, have you all done any analysis of the charitable deduction expenditure, and whether or not we as a nation are getting the value of that lost revenue in returned programming and services for Americans through that charitable deduction?
We've done some work with regard to tax preferences in general. I do not recall any particular work that's focused specifically with regard to the charitable deduction and the value for money implication, but I'll check and provide for the record a specific answer.
Let me offer any of the witnesses if they have any comment with regard to any work that may have been done to analyze that particular expenditure, the charitable deduction, and its value to America.
There has been some academic work done. I'll have to check on whether CBO has published work. The academic work has raised some interesting possibilities. So, for example, there's a recent study that shows a match for a charitable contribution may be more effective in eliciting charitable contributions than money back in your pocket, which is basically what the current tax preference does. So you give $1 to a charity and there's a matching contribution that may generate, that according to one study generated more activity than you give $1 to the charity and you get something back in your pocket in exchange.
Okay, and Dr. Orszag, I'm actually interested in the output side of that transaction where we then determine how that charity uses the money. I'd like to find out if anyone has analyzed how those organizations that receive that charitable deduction employ those dollars that they get as a result of taxpayers having less money to have to pay into the Treasury. Money foregone, my understanding, it's about $32 billion that the Treasury foregoes because people make these charitable deductions to these nonprofit organizations. And I'm interested in finding out, for example, if we're getting our dollars worth. I know that there are a lot of poor people in this country. I'm wondering how many of those charitable contributions end up helping people who are poor, helping people who have no health care.
You're raising a very interesting point. First, there is audit authority and evaluation authority that we have, for example, when you're dealing with federal grants. All right? So they're on the radar screen because they go through the appropriations process and the budget process. But tax preferences don't. That's not federal money. It's foregone federal revenues.
Right.
And therefore, you'd even have an issue of whether or not we would have the audit authority with regard to a tax preference. That's not federal money. It's foregone revenues.
Let me see if any of you wish to volunteer an opinion on whether or not we are making the best investment of tax dollars or foregone tax dollars by providing this particular tax expenditure, the charitable deduction.
Well, let me just say there are a variety of tax preferences associated with the nonprofit and charitable sector, not just the contribution one that you noted, but also the fact that they do not pay tax on their net revenue.
Correct.
And there have been questions that have been raised about the degree to which some of those entities are performing services and doing things that are quasi-commercial in nature, and the dividing line between a purely charitable activity and a quasi-commercial activity has become blurred. CBO has done some work on that in the past and will be doing more in the future. And I guess I would leave it at that. There have been questions raised about that line. And then you're raising another issue, which is even within the charitable, even within that more clearly charitable set of activities, how effective are they in actually achieving their objectives? And again, I think that's something that we don't have good answers on.
General.
Two comments real quick. First, there is some called UBTI, Unrelated Business Taxable Income. And for example, AARP pays a lot of money, a lot of tax on that because they make a lot of money with regard to their insurance programs. Furthermore, we have done work at GAO for the Senate on the issue of not-for-profit entities, for example, hospitals, and whether or not there's a meaningful difference at the type of services that they're providing versus for-profit hospitals, because obviously they are gaining a benefit through tax-exempt status, and presumably there should be a public welfare gain from that.
And Mr. Chairman, I see my time has expired. If I could just explore one final question. Is there something, General Walker, that we can do to perhaps expand that examination? Because I think it's a legitimate concern to find out if there is a difference between what a not-for-profit hospital is providing to the public versus a for-profit hospital, and whether or not there's a reason to give a not-for-profit hospital a tax advantage over a for-profit hospital in the work that they do in a community. I also think there's a reason to explore whether or not many foundations are doing the work that we expect of them, especially family foundations, are doing the work we expect of them to provide the general welfare of the public for the foregone taxes that they would otherwise pay. Is there something there that you think would be worth exploring by the GAO?
Well, first, let me do two things. One, I will provide back to your office information on what we have done and what we are doing with regard to not-for-profit hospitals. Secondly, I also want to think about whether or not there may be additional authorities that we might need in order to be able to do evaluations in situations where the federal government is foregoing billions of dollars of revenue and has a legitimate interest in trying to understand what public good is being obtained from that. There may be some need to look at our access authority and our audit authority there.
I look forward to hearing back from you on that. Mr. Chairman, I thank you very much. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Becerra. Mr. Ryan, do you have any further questions? No. Well, let me say to our witnesses today, Director Johnson, General Walker, Director Orszag, thank you very much for your time, and more than that, for your insightful advice on a topic that we clearly need to pay more attention to. Also, earlier on, I recognize the contribution of Dr. Posner and Barry Anderson as well. Dr. Posner is here. We appreciate you coming in, and we appreciate your very methodical and clear set of proposals that you set out in your testimony. Thank you very much indeed. The hearing is adjourned. Got you out of here for lunch. Thank you.